Myself, Dr. Hanuman Prasad. I am working as an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry at Institute of Aeronautical Engineering, IARE, located at Dundigal. The topic that I am going to discuss is from Module 4, Gender-Based Violence. And the name of the topic is Gender-Based Violence from Human Rights Perspective. The contents that I am going to discuss in today's session are Introduction to Gender-Based Violence and Human Rights, next Instruments and Measures adopted by the United Nations, next Instruments adopted by the Council of Europe, next Action at national level remains essential, next Important policies or bodies at national level. Next, funding for GBV means gender-based violence, GBV prevention programs. Next, human rights impacts of aid policies. Next, human rights commitments. And finally, references. Let's look at all of these contents one by one in detail. The first content is Introduction to Gender-Based Violence. Gender-based violence is a human rights concern. One should know this first of all. Gender-based violence is a human rights concern. So without knowing this, one cannot move forward. So before coming to this topic, what is gender-based violence? Gender-based violence is a human rights concern. People who experience gender-based violence may suffer from different human rights violations. Okay, so those who are facing gender-based violence, shortly it is represented as GBV. G for gender, B for based, V for violence. Gender-based violence can be shortly represented as GBV. So people who experience GBV are treated to suffer from human rights violations, because GBV is human rights concern. If one violates human rights, then only the particular person faces gender-based violence or GBV. The examples include right to life, freedom from torture, degrading treatment, freedom from discrimination, and right to safety and security. So these are all the examples of human rights. So one should follow all these human rights, because GBV is a human rights concern. If one violates these human rights, then only a particular person faces GBV, gender-based violence. Okay, so those human rights concerns are right to life, freedom from torture, degrading treatment, freedom from discrimination, and right to safety and security. Okay, all these rights can be found in international and regional human rights documents, in particular by the United Nations and by the Council of Europe. Okay, particularly these are found in the documents, human rights documents of United Nations and European Council. Okay, so let's look at the next content. After understanding the introduction to GBV and human rights, so one faces GBV if he or she violates human rights. Okay, so that is what is the conclusion from this introduction slide. Let's move on to the next slide, our next content. Instruments and measures adopted by the United Nations. What are the instruments and measures as a part of human rights are adopted by the United Nations, UN? The right to life, gender equality, prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of sex, protection of physical integrity, okay, right to health are a few of the human rights impacted by GBV. These are few of human rights impacted by GBV, gender-based violence. These are safeguarded in the universal documents or universal declaration of human rights and the international covenants on civil and political rights and on social, economic and cultural rights. Okay, so these are safeguarded in the universal declaration of human rights and the international covenants on civil and political rights and also on social, economical and cultural rights. Okay, and also the United Nations adopted scientific instruments and scientific measures in order to step the combat against violence and discrimination against women. Okay, so United Nations also adopted the scientific measurements and scientific instruments in order to step the combat means war against violence and discrimination against especially women, those who are facing GBV, gender-based violence, as a part of human rights concern. Okay, so these are the instruments and measures adopted by the United Nations. Okay, let's move on to the next content. Instruments adopted by the Council of Europe. So you can say Council of Europe as European Council. European Council. Yes. So gender equality and gender-based violence are firstly addressed by human rights instruments as a human rights issue. So as a human rights issue, two things are firstly addressed. First one is gender equality, means both men and women are masculine and feminine, or boy and girl are equal. So that is called gender equality. And gender-based violence, GBV, as I told, are firstly addressed by human rights instruments as a part of human rights issue. Okay, the human rights instruments include the European Convention on Human Rights. So the instruments include European Convention on Human Rights and European Social Charter. Okay, so the instruments adopted by the European Council are European Convention on Human Rights and European Social Charter. These two are the instruments adopted by Council of Europe or European Council. What are the two instruments adopted by European Council? European Convention on Human Rights and European Social Charter. Okay? The growing awareness of the extent and persistence of the problem has led to the creation of scientific instruments addressing gender-based violence in its various forms. We know that gender-based violence has various forms, which I have explained in the previous session. Okay, so one has to have awareness, and this awareness is keep on growing to avoid the GBV. Okay, so to avoid the problem of GBV and creation of scientific instruments and addressing gender-based violence in its various forms. Okay, so in overall, the instruments adopted by European Council are European Convention on Human Rights and European Social Charter. Okay, let's move on to the next slide or next content. Action at national level remains essential. So at national level, the action remains essential, means the action is crucial at national level to stop or to prevent GBV, gender-based violence. Despite the significant progress achieved with the human rights instruments, recognition and existing legal measures are not sufficient. Okay, so in spite of the significant progress achieved with the human rights instruments, recognition and existing legal measures are not sufficient, because it is not widespreading. It is only limited at particular area, particular region, but it has to spread throughout the nation. So that is why action at the national level remains essential. Okay, effective mechanisms and processes for violence prevention and gender mainstreaming need to be put in place. What has to be put in place? Effective mechanisms and processes for violence prevention and also gender mainstreaming. All these three things need to be put in proper place or proper address. These have to be addressed properly. Okay. In addition to the international human rights mechanisms, important policies or bodies at national level need to include certain actions to avoid gender-based violence, to avoid GBV. Okay. So, in addition to these international human rights mechanisms, important policies or bodies at national level need to include certain actions to avoid GBV. Okay. Hence, the action to prevent GBV in India remains essential. So, this is the reason why the action to prevent GBV in India especially, that means at national level, remains essential. Okay. So, what has to be understood from this content? Effective mechanisms and processes for violence prevention and gender mainstreaming have to be addressed properly at national level, means in India. Okay. So, let's move on to the next content. Important policies or bodies at national level. What are the important policies or what are the important bodies at national level that have been committed to address GBV or to avoid GBV? Okay. To prevent GBV, important policies or bodies at national level need to include national committees for gender advancement with a clear plan of action. So, the important policies or bodies at national level are national committees for gender advancement with a clear plan of action. So, our India should include or should organize national committee for gender advancement with a clear plan of action, not just proposing, with a clear plan of action, how to proceed it, how to approach it, okay, and how to achieve it. So that is a clear plan of action. Okay. So India should organize national committees for gender advancements with a clear plan of action. And equality ombudsman. Equality ombudsman means equality organizations. Means gender should be treated equally. Okay. Men are strong, women are weak. Not like that. Men are not beautiful, women are beautiful. Not like that. Both have to be treated equally. So that is called gender equality. So organizations should be there to create awareness on equality of gender. Okay. That is called ombudsman. Ombudsman means organizations. And effective legislation to ensure legal and substantive equality. So, second one is gender equality based organizations and effective legislation to ensure legal and substantive equality, means real equality, not just for the sake, not just we have achieved gender equality, not like that, not morally. It has to be substantial, means it has to be real, it has to be practical. Okay. So like that, effective legislation to ensure legal and substantive equality should be there. And affirmative action means the action which has to be taken strictly, such as quotas for women in education as well as in employment. Okay. Quotas for women in education as well as in employment, so that gender equality will be achieved practically. Okay. There should be certain quotas for women in education as well as in employment, so that women will be equally coming in par with men in all the fields like education and employment. then this GBV can be avoided to the maximum extent. Okay, and our India should also conduct women's NGOs. NGOs means non-governmental organizations. What are NGOs? Non-governmental organizations. So especially for women's. And LGBT plus means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender. So these organizations must be conducted by our India. Okay, and LGBT plus studies in universities, they should also be equally in par with men and women. Okay, so they cannot do anything because by birth they will be like that. So they also have to be treated equally, and they also have to be studied properly along with us in universities. And they also should get proper employment to avoid GBV. Okay, so that is what are the important policies at national level. What are the important policies at national level? Especially to avoid GBV, gender-based violence. First one, national committee should be conducted for gender advancement with a clear plan of action. And second one, gender equality ombudsmen, means gender equality organization should be there to create awareness on gender equality. And effective legislation should be there to ensure legal and substantial equality. And affirmative actions such as quotas for women in educational field and employment fields. And women's NGOs should be there, LGBT plus organizations should be there, and universities must allow LGBTs to study their education or to pursue their education, so that GBV can be avoided at national level. Okay, so I hope you all understood what are the important policies or bodies at national level to avoid GBV. Okay, let's move on to the next content. Funding for GBV prevention programs. Whatever the GBV prevention programs or GBV prevention policies or bodies that we have discussed. So funding for them, funding for those programs that we are discussing in this slide. Rates of GBV, rates of gender-based violence, increased starkly during the COVID-19 pandemic as governments offered confused and inadequate responses to predictable shifts in vulnerability. Okay, so rates of GBV means gender-based violence rates increased starkly during the COVID-19 pandemic especially. Okay, as governments offered confused and inadequate responses to predictable shifts in vulnerability. Vulnerability means dependency, or if somebody is independent, then he is invulnerable. If somebody is dependent on someone, then it is called vulnerability. Okay, so during COVID-19 pandemic situation, government offered confused and means unclear and inadequate responses to predictable shifts in vulnerability. And interventions aimed at reducing GBV prevalence and improving care for survivors remain grossly under-resourced. What happened due to the lack of funding for the awareness on GBV prevention programs or GBV prevention policies or GBV prevention bodies at national level? The interventions are which are aimed at reducing GBV or which are aimed at avoiding GBV prevalence and improving care for survivors remains grossly under-resourced. Okay, means it is not provided with funding. Calls for increased GBV funding and for what works to prevent and respond to GBV are common, even as new commitments to eliminate GBV gradually emerge. Okay, so India has called for GBV funding. These calls have been increased because of growing GBV, growing gender-based violence. So in order to avoid or in order to prevent GBV, So India has called for GBV funding. Okay, and for what works to prevent and respond to GBV. So means what are the necessary actions to be taken to prevent GBV are common even as new commitments to eliminate GBV gradually emerge. So slowly, so there were new commitments emerged to eliminate or to avoid GBV. Okay. In many low and middle income countries, foreign donors play a major source of funding for these initiatives, making it critical to understand who and what they fund and whether it aligns with human rights principles. Okay, so in many low and middle income countries, especially India like countries, foreign donors means other country donors play a major source of funding. So they have come forward for funding to avoid or to eliminate or to prevent GBV in these kind of low income and middle income countries. So they have taken initiatives by providing funding, making it critical to understand who and what they fund. So even people cannot understand who funded and what they have funded, but they have funded. And whether it aligns with human rights principles, so according to human rights principles only they have funded, or beyond the human rights principles they have funded. So these things are not understood properly. So in that way they have provided funding to avoid or to prevent GBV. Okay, so that is how foreign bodies came forward to provide funding to prevent GBV at low income and middle income countries. Okay, then only the awareness organizations can be established to prevent GBV. Okay, let's move on to the next content. Human rights impacts of aid policies. Whatever the aid policies to avoid GBV, on them, what are the impacts of human rights? So that is what we are going to discuss in this content. Donor decisions can influence and reinforce systems and processes that limit progress towards fulfillment of the right to health. Okay, so these donor decisions can influence and reinforce systems and processes that limit progress towards fulfillment of the right to health. This is one of the main human rights concern, right to health. It points to the need for greater donor transparency. Donor must be transparent. He should not be unclear. He should be clear. He should be transparent. What he is doing, why he is providing funding, for what purpose he is providing funding. He should not have any selfishness in that. He must be transparent. And accountability surrounding the direct and indirect human rights impacts of aid policies. So this point gives information that donors must have greater transparency and accountability surrounding the direct and indirect human rights impacts on aid policies. This is especially urgent as GBV rates rise and economic crises fuel pressures to adopt retrogressive health and aid policies. Okay, so these kind of transparent and accountable funding is urgent at that situation because of the increasing GBV rates and the increasing economic crisis. Okay, which fuel pressures to adopt this kind of retrogressive health and aid policies. Retrogressive means down to up. So generally from lower level to higher level people will migrate, but this retrogressive means higher level to lower level. So because of the retrogressive health, means the health, as per right to health should improve slowly. But here what is happening? Retrogressive health is happening, means health is diminishing, higher to lower it is happening. So because of these things, the transparent and accountable funding bodies are urgent. Okay, and also to account the increase in GBV rates. Okay, so this is why GBV policies, funding bodies are urgent. Okay, and donors should act urgently to revise policies that promote or complicit in discrimination, and to ensure transparency and participation required for scientific progress and human rights accountability. So as I said, so this should be urgently revised by the donor bodies, means especially foreign donors. Okay, so especially to ensure transparency, means why they are providing funding without having any other intention. Okay, and their participation required. Okay, their transparency and accountability and their participation in a proper manner is accurately required. Okay, so donor bodies transparency and accountability and their participation without having any other intention is must and should for improving the actions against GBV. Okay, so these are the human rights impacts of aid policies. Okay, let's move on to the next content. Human rights commitments. What are the commitments made by the human rights committees? Okay, increase transparency about loan funding transparent strategies. First one is increase transparency about loan funding strategies. That is what I have discussed in the previous slide also. One has to increase transparency about the funding strategies, and disbursements providing timely information. Okay, so timely information must be there. What is going on, what is happening, what action is under process. All these things should be informed timely. And on what and who is funded. What and who is funded. How interventions are selected for funding. Okay, and what outcomes and learnings those investments produced. Okay, finally, what outcomes and learnings those investments have produced. So this is what are the commitments given by human rights committees. Okay, so transparency of funding strategies, disbursements providing timely information, and what and who is funded, and what outcomes and learning were produced by those investments are must and should. Okay, ensure that shifts in funding strategies do not result in retrogressive outcomes. So if the funding strategies are shifted, it should not result in retrogressive outcomes. Means it should not result in higher to lower level outcomes. Always the shifting in strategies or funding strategies must include lower to higher level growth. Okay, but not vice versa. Data monitoring systems should provide timely, disaggregated information that is inclusive of all forms of GBV and allows for analysis of intersectional drivers of GBV, especially as they affect stigmatized and marginalized populations. Okay, so this is very crucial to understand. Our data monitoring systems should provide timely disaggregated information, means our data monitoring systems should provide timely information, and disaggregated information means genuine information that is inclusive of which is inclusive of all forms of GBV that were faced by the different kinds of people, whether he is a man or woman or lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender, whoever it is. It should be given timely information and genuine information. So whatever the form of GBV it is, it should be given the proper, timely and genuine information, which allows for proper analysis of intersectional drivers of GBV. Then only the committee can analyze how this GBV is happening and why it is happening, what is the source of the GBV, and the organization can take certain actions which are necessary to avoid that kind of that form of GBV. I hope you understood. And especially as they affect, which kind of people? Stigmatized people, means those who have some kind of stigmata, some kind of remarks, some kind of, whether it is especially bad remarks. So it is affecting those kind of people, and also marginalized people. Okay, marginalized means who are not grown, who are not developed in advanced way. Okay, those are marginalized population. Okay, so these kind of GBV forms can especially affect stigmatized, means which are having some remarks in bad way, and marginalized population. Marginalized means the people who are backward, either economically or in development wise. Okay, so one should understand why the human rights commitments are mentioned here. By these commitments only one can completely achieve the violation of these human rights, and one can put them in proper way, and people can avoid GBV as the result of these human rights commitments. I hope you all understood. These will especially affect stigmatized people and marginalized people. So one should act properly, and one should understand, one should have awareness, gender equality must be there, and broad thinking must be there to avoid this kind of GBV, gender based violence. Okay, so this is what is the gender based violence in perspective of human rights, or in human rights perspective. Okay, and the references that I have followed are Gender Studies by Kadambari, and Gender Sensitization by Rajalakshmi Kalyani, and I have followed one more website, Gender Matters / Gender Based Violence and Human Rights. From this website, most of the information is taken. Okay, so thank you very much for your kind attention.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.